In this segment of my conversation with Susan Shelton from Washington State's Department of Health, we're talking about rules around employee health and communication. So, what that means is we're going to talk about what symptoms an employee might be experiencing that they need to communicate to your leadership team, how your leadership team needs to negotiate and navigate what that means, and when somebody is eligible or not eligible to be working within your food service operations, and the rare cases when symptoms or diagnoses need to be reported to the health department. And so let's get to it. Welcome back to our continuing conversation with Susan Shelton from the Washington State's Department of Health. We're talking about changes in the retail food code, which happens on an 8-year cycle. And there's been a little bit of grace given to that cycle because it landed slap dab in the middle of that thing we call COVID. Previously, we've talked about changes in date marking, and we've talked about changes in the expectations of having a certified food protection manager. And now we're going to be talking about employee health reportings. I understand that I'm adding the word reportings where I don't need to, but before we get too far ahead, Susan, in case for those people who are just plugging in here instead of the other two, give us a brief rundown of you and what you do.
So again, this is Susan with Washington State Department of Health. I work in the food safety program, and one of my primary roles every few years is to actually help oversee the rule revision process. And as you've mentioned, Andy, it is a stakeholder process. It takes us several years. We did have a little bit of an extension this year with all the activity related to COVID.
Of the three topics that we've talked about so far, this being the third, this one's probably one of the trickier ones because it falls more solidly into the human interaction realm. Let's talk about that and what it is, and then let's take a brief moment to talk about what do we do about it. You'll understand what I mean when we get to that point. So tell us, what are we talking about here? Employee health reporting.
Right. So, there are a lot of key components to food safety, keeping foods controlled, temperatures controlled, keeping the equipment clean. But actually, one of the primary ones is employee health. And it's all about the illnesses that we can spread as people, as food workers, onto food or equipment or to other coworkers. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that that's something that is evaluated on a regular basis. Believe it or not, the code didn't change too much on this section. However, what we found when we did the rule revision is a lot of people were surprised by what kind of symptoms and illnesses had to be reported. And so we want to make sure that we're talking about it a little bit more. Also, because of COVID, I think some of the symptoms got a little bit confusing because we've been watching for, coughing, sneezing, a lot of things that we traditionally don't worry about necessarily when we're handling food, because those aren't things that can generally spread through food. So the idea here is that we want to refocus everyone on the symptoms and the illnesses that you do need to talk to staff about. There are a lot that you don't have to talk to, food workers about. You don't want to get into their private business. And I think that's what's really important for managers to understand. Sometimes I'm like, no, you have to get into their private business on these items right here. And so that's what's important for this conversation.
Let's talk about those. What are the big ones?
Yeah. So the big ones for us for symptoms, if they have active diarrhea, vomit, and jaundice, that needs to be reported to the person in charge. You need to know that. And if you hear one of those three words and it's active, it means it's going on right now, that worker cannot come in to work a shift.
How does somebody know if they have jaundice?
Yeah, it's good. So jaundice, generally the way you know is you start to see some physical changes. So usually what jaundice is often is something's wrong with the liver. But with food safety, it could be something called hepatitis A. And so what you're going to see is start turning yellow. So usually it's the whites of the eyes that turn yellow. The skin tone can turn yellow. Sometimes the gums can turn yellow. The food worker will also feel sick generally. But on visual, what you'll often see is just a yellowing of the skin.
So that's something that someone in restaurant leadership can be looking out for. I know so many people in my life, and I've probably been guilty of it myself, that I'm not feeling quite right. And so I'm going to ignore it until it goes away. So I may be the last person to notice that I'm turning into a Simpsons character. But I come walking in. If you see one of your employees and they're yellowy, how do you recommend you have that conversation? Do you, it's like, hey, have you been feeling okay?
Okay, So here's the thing. What's important here is that you have the conversation before this comes up. Okay, This is where, that communication skills about being a manager, you have to be preventative, because you're right. If this comes up when you see something looks a little bit off, it's like, well, that's the last time it's like, well, this is not the best time to start this conversation.
Yeah.
And so what's key here is that, when you hire someone new, it's like, wait, here are our expectations. Here are your requirements. Make sure we're on the same page. And so that's where you really have this discussion, because the vast majority of people are not comfortable talking about diarrhea.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily comfortable
Yeah.
talking about vomit. And jaundice is a word that people are like, I don't even know what this means.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's an important concept. And so, if I were a manager, I'm like, I would have this conversation with them when they first hired. I would be clear with them. I would make sure my staff knows what these words mean and why it's important to my business to actually tell me. Because a lot of workers are like, oh no, I feel okay. I can come in and help. I'm telling you right now, that's probably your biggest liability. Somebody that's working when they're infectious and they don't want to let you down. It's like, no, you're not letting me down. You're kind of helping our business here, because it unfortunately can spread. And not only through food, to your equipment, to your, the food contact surfaces, but also potentially to your other workers. The reason why we're so careful about certain illnesses is because they can spread through food. And when we say they can spread through food, it's because it takes very little to make you sick. Okay, so we're not taking it lightly. We're like, no, this is, from my perspective, you can tell I'm getting a little heated on this.
Yeah, go
but
for it.
From my perspective, I'm like, this is, for a liability, this is it. This is one of your key liabilities that is probably hidden from you if you're not asking.
Yeah, I think it's great that we're talking about this, because I've become a passionate advocate for upstream thinking, being preventative, proactive instead of reactive. And this is a great example of that, because some of these illnesses, it's not just about spreading it through food to other guests, it's about spreading it across your staff. And everyone's had the experience these last couple of years of being forced to close for days because you've had an outbreak of something among your staff. You don't have the staff to operate safely.
And I think it's really key. And so it's what we consider a culture, right? And so your workers, your staff, your coworkers will match whatever kind of bar you set. And so if you set that bar pretty low, it's like, oh, all right, we don't take it seriously. It's not that big of a deal, whatever. But I'm like, no. I mean, and I used to be a food worker. Maybe that's why I'm so heated on this, because I'm like, I don't know what I would have done if I was a food worker. I'm like, would I have gone into work? Because I don't remember really being trained on it.
I know. I know it. I know that I know that I've contributed. All I did was I treated the symptoms. If I could have a sinus infection and I'm going to treat it with Sudafed and keep on working. I know I did it.
Right.
And I was a responsible guy. Well,
yeah, no, I got you. I was very similar. I just wasn't aware. I mean, I was like, I didn't realize this. And so that's what we're trying to do. And so those are the key symptoms. The diarrhea, vomit, especially. The jaundice will probably be very rare. It's like when your diarrhea is done, when your vomit's done, then start the timer and do 24 hours, and then you can come back in.
What you're recommending, and that I 100% agree with, is you're advocating for using this to foster a culture of wellness. So bring it up when you're hiring them. Take opportunities to remind them, put up signage. And I think that it's critically important to not just say, here's another rule that you have to follow, but here's a new rule. Here's why we want to follow it. Here's why it's important. And here's what we can do once that has become reported.
Let's talk about when you have a diagnosis. Now, this is much more rare, that somebody actually goes to a doctor and the doctor says, hey, I took a sample. This is what you have. And so we have some select illnesses. There are 5. It's Salmonella, E. coli, but the full name is Shiga toxin producing E. coli, Shigella, hepatitis A, and the one we added was norovirus. That's what's new in this code revision. We just added norovirus. That's the one that you hear about a lot with outbreaks. You'll hear people, stuff like, man, I was vomiting, it's like, that's probably norovirus. And so if you go to the doctor and the doctor, says, hey, you've been diagnosed, that also has to be reported to the person in charge, the manager, but then the person in charge has to report that to the health department. Here's the other modifications we made in the code. We have to be able to verify that you've trained your staff on this.
Okay. So yeah, sign-offs. Okay.
Right. A sign-off, or like you said, to sit there and go, hey, we posted this sign. It's clear. They know that they're supposed to read it. We've told them. When we ask staff, can you tell me what symptoms, you required to report to your manager? They say, oh, well, it's vomiting, diarrhea, and jaundice. And look, I've got it right here on this poster. You can figure out a way, but we want to make sure that we can verify that your staff is trained on this. That's a new component for this code.
Let's see if we can spend our last couple minutes coming up with a really catchy jingle, shall we? I'm kidding. Let's not create a vomit diarrhea jingle. So the last part that I want to talk about, just kind of touch on, is more like, coaching, counseling, and that is, I know that the stress of, and as there's a layer of skepticism from restaurateurs, is I'm trying to find delicate words, but I think there's a lot of restaurant managers are going to think, I'm going to have my staff just going to be making up vomit and diarrhea rule, to get out of work so they can go party with their friends over the weekend or something like that. So I believe, and tell me if I'm wrong, you don't need a note from a doctor. So you can't, as a manager, say, "Oh, you got diarrhea? Go prove it to a doctor and bring me a note." That's just going to make the situation worse. And so, do you have any advice on that, or is this just something that we're just going to kind of have to try to navigate?
I will say right now we're investigating an outbreak that is similar to this. Oh, I thought the staff was just saying, and we're like, now we've got cases, so we've definitely seen it where, sometimes managers are like, oh, I'm sure they're just, just saying this to get off of work. You need to have that where you can trust your workers. And the way you do that is by setting a standard and you maintain it and you preach it and then you keep it going. But you have to have that culture because if they're telling you that they're sick, they're required to report to you. And from my perspective, you are required to make sure they don't work until their symptoms are gone.
Thank you for this portion of the conversation, Susan. We're going to move in the next recording into rules about safely clean up vomit and diarrhea. Thankfully, we don't have to clean up jaundice. All right. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, everybody. Plug in for the next episode.